Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the third session in the Royal Irish Academy series on COVID-19, Perspectives and Pathways in a Time of Crisis. My name is Daniel Gerry, and I'm Vice President of the Academy and Director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. The purpose of the series is to further the RIA's mission as an institution committed to discussion and debate to advance the public good. The need for shared knowledge and understanding to inform our thinking and policy making has never been greater as we contend with the crisis and plan for the future. Today, our discussion focuses on social justice and rebuilding Ireland. Recordings of the two previous sessions, the first was on the science of COVID-19 and the second on economic crises past and present, are available on the RIA's website. COVID-19 comes with a set of pressing social challenges. It also comes with unexpected opportunities for doing things in a different way. The disruption to our lives caused by the pandemic gives us the space to imagine how we can build our society back in a better way. It helps us focus on the values we want to foreground, as well as rebuilding Ireland in this period of time. Over 210 people have signed up for today's event. Our chair today is Professor Yvonne Galligan, who has brought this together. I'm very grateful to her. Yvonne is Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for TU Dublin, and she's also a member of the RIA's Ethics, Political, Legal and Philosophical Committee. Quick word of thanks to Jennifer Keneally at the RIA, who is running the show from behind the scenes today. Yvonne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It takes a moment to unmute, so here we are. Today, I am joined by 4 engaging and informed speakers to help us consider how COVID-19 is impacting our society, our human relationships, and our societal structures. We will also look at how we can remake our society in response to the social challenges raised by COVID-19. So I would like to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is going to be Sinead Burke. Sinead is an academic, a writer, and an advocate. Maybe Jennifer, you could move on to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. Sorry, to Sinead. Yeah, great. Sinead works towards accelerating systemic change within the domains of education, design, and communications. Sinead has an illustrious career. She was the only Irish female delegate at the World Economic Forum's 2018 annual meeting in Davos, and she returned then in 2019 as a cultural leader of Davos's programme. Sinead is also a member of Ireland's Council of State, and her debut children's book, Break the Mold, will be published by Wren and Rook in October this year. Our next speaker will be Gerry McRourke. So Gerry is head of the School of Education at NUI Galway. He has published widely in the areas of leadership for inclusive schooling, language and social class, literacy, as well as in the areas of leadership and school improvement for equity and social justice. He was expert advisor to the EU Commission's European Policy Network on School Leadership and has advised a range of ministries of education in Europe. Our third speaker will be Salome Mbugua Henry. Salome is Commissioner for Irish Human Rights and Equality. She is founder of Akidwa, the Migrant Women's Network. Salome has over 20 years' experience of working with underrepresented groups, particularly women, children, and young people in Europe, Africa, and internationally. She is the president of European Network of Migrant Women and sits on the EU expert group on economic migration. Among her distinguished credentials, Salome in 2015 was OHCHR UN Fellow of People of African Descent and she was 2010 Eisenhower Fellow on Women and Leadership. Our final speaker today is Colette Bennett. Colette is Research and Policy Analyst for Social Justice Ireland. Colette joined Social Justice Ireland in 2018, having spent almost a decade engaged with social policy and advocacy work on behalf of a large debt organisation, among other activities. In December 2016, Colette led an EU special mission to Cyprus to support the insolvency service of Cyprus. She's a qualified solicitor with a master's degree in social justice and public policy. So I'm sure you will all agree that we have an amazing lineup of speakers today. Each speaker will present their thoughts in a 5 to 7 minute statement. And when statements conclude, we will begin the conversation with you, our attendees. Before we begin our conversation, here are some housekeeping arrangements. To aid our participants who are hard of hearing or who for other reasons cannot listen to the spoken word, we have sign language interpreters, and we also have a captioning facility. I will chair the proceedings, which means that I will keep our speakers to time. I will present the questions from you that will come in via the chat function, and I will close the conversation after. First to you to begin our conversation today.
Yvonne, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this wonderful seminar. And I am so thrilled that we do have sign language interpretation and captioning available also for our discussion today. Very explicitly, when thinking about this topic, I wanted to center it in an experience that is relevant to me, but also one that perhaps has not been considered most often when we talk about rebuilding Ireland, the impacts of COVID-19, and social justice more broadly. And that is the experience of disability. And throughout the next few minutes, asking you to think about how we can insert disability policies and praxis from the very center of our position as we approach whatever we may define as the new normal. For me, that begins with just one simple phrase: nothing about us without us. It was an academic term that was created in order to ensure that participation was at the heart of research, particularly for children, disabled people, and minority communities at large. The iteration of a phrase like that is much simpler than it is in practice. Ensuring that we are including disabled experiences and disabled voices at the very beginning and at the epicenter of all our plans and progress is something that we really need to activate in all of our minds and ways of working as we go forward. It is not something that we have done historically. If we could take a broad look at the history of disability, not just in Ireland, but globally, we have moved through specific models of how we have spoken to, about, and with disabled people, and in particular, how we treat them and insert them, or include them, or lack thereof within our society. Historically, we looked at disability through a medical model, focusing on the individual's needs, their specific medical condition, and really dehumanizing the most empathetic aspect about them. We ensured that in terms of the best way to interact with disabled people was, in a sense, isolation. We cared for, not cared with. Over time, we have moved people out of the institutionalization that began within that medical model of disability, bringing it into a charitable model, understanding that their needs required resources. We have since moved out of that charitable model, understanding that disability and charity are not synonyms of each other, that what we require is a social model rooted in human rights. So now when we speak about disability, we talk about it as the individual. We talk about it as the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and ensuring that a right to dignity, a right to housing, and a right to access are fundamental to how we approach and rebuild a society. There are some challenges with that. As a country, as a small nation, we have moved through those models quite quickly. And for many people who do not interact with disabled people or the community at large on an ongoing basis, there is a discomfort. That discomfort creates apathy, and in a sense, has landed us in a position where the phrase "nothing about us without us" seems so complicated to make tangible. To give you a very trite and quick example of something in my own lived experience, I'm a little person, and I will often be in a grocery store and a supermarket, and a child will see me and they will spot me and they will say to a parent or an adult, "Look, there is a little woman." Perhaps you've had an experience like this yourself. What the adult will do in that scenario is something entirely alien, and they will tell that child to be quiet. They will remove that child from my presence, and they will not teach that child that I am a person just like them. That is because they do not want to insult me. They do not want to say the wrong thing, and they do not know what the right terminology or rhetoric really is. That is a microcosm, an example of our world at large. And we need to get better at leaning into that discomfort and really understanding about how we can make inclusivity a reality rather than just a phrase that is marketed and used quite freely. But how can we do that? How can we do that in Ireland? How can we do that globally, particularly in an era of COVID-19? I think it's also worth reflecting on what is happening globally as regards to disability and COVID-19. Our neighbour has coined the term the great equalizer in relation to this disease. And perhaps that's because those with enormous privilege and power can also track this disease. But what we're eliminating and what we're erasing is the impacts that this has on disabled people more broadly. Specifically, for example, even within the NHS in the UK, they had a scoring system that when a patient arrived into the hospital, this scoring system was used to decide who receives critical care. It was known as the clinical frailty scale, and it ranked patients from 1 to 9 to prioritise those who would recover from COVID-19. That framing of disability and prioritisation of able-bodiedness is damaging, not just within the epicentre of the virus, but in thinking about how we begin to construct an exit strategy for this moment. So what does the future look like? As we rebuild this new normal, or whatever lexicon you might be able to define within this moment, what is required? It's about centering the disabled experience and understanding that every policy is a disability rights issue, and ensuring that through that lens of disability rights, we are taking an intersectional one and not just providing opportunities that are for white, straight, cisgender disabled people. We are a broad, diverse community in and of ourselves. But it's about listening to those voices. A very simple example is looking at the approaches that we have taken to working from home. For so long, the disabled community have requested the flexibility in this notion of work in order to be able to work from spaces that are more accessible or in a way in which they can receive care or the treatments or the medical equipment that they may need. The majority said no, it was impossible to work in a way that was flexible from home. This moment has taught us it's not impossible. There was just no desire to do so. So it's about asking that question. What can we ensure and do to ensure that the desire of the majority is not required to ensure that a minority's needs and requirements are met in day-to-day? I think this is also something we need to think about when we are rebuilding our cities, when we are thinking about the pedestrianisation of retail spaces to ignite the economy, or if we are critiquing the ability to drive cars through a public space, particularly a very large park. Who are we thinking about when we are making these decisions? How often do we look around the room in which powerful decisions are being made and calculate the diversity and quantify the varied lived experience that exists within that room? It's rare. Perhaps it can be considered as tokenism, but I fundamentally believe that if our exclusion is explicit, due to our own biases and consciousness that we're not even aware of, our inclusion must also be explicit. We must be deliberate in who we are providing for, rooted in the lived experience of that community and those individuals. Otherwise, this opportunity that we now have to craft a country that is fabricated with social justice and principles of equality, we have an opportunity to do better and to build an Ireland that we can be proud of for all citizens, but we must include them from the very outset, including people with disabilities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sinead. I think your thoughts are going to be very rich in terms of our discussion going forward. I would like to bring our second speaker, Gerry McRourke, in to understand his interpretation of our theme today. Over to you, Gerry.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. It's great to be here, and it's lovely to have such a huge number of people taking part in this webinar and to have such a high level of interest in this topic. So I look forward to sharing my views and to further conversations at the end of this. As you might expect from somebody who's working in the field of education, I'm taking as March the 12th as the point of departure for my thoughts this afternoon. I think that March the 12th was a kind of a day that will be forever in people's memories and teachers' memories, and in school, anyone who's connected with school will be very much, will always remember March the 12th. When I look at it, it was certainly more than the usual. I have a note in my journal from school when people were sent home to start to be taught at home. It was like, build me a school. Can I have a computer of some kind or other? I need better broadband. I need you to find ways of helping me get engaged if I can't do it myself. I need you to devise, this is to parents and guardians, I need you to devise strategies to help me learn when I get stuck. And then you have to differentiate that for the number of children or young people that you have in your house. That was a big ask for parents. I think it was an extraordinary demand put on parents, communities, guardians across the country. Also, at the start of this, I think it's really important to recognize the difference between homeschooling and this notion of what happened during the COVID crisis, where we were sent home, because this is not homeschooling, because wrapping it or talking about it as homeschooling to some degree makes it seem like a choice, which homeschooling is. This wasn't a choice, this was an emergency response. And it's important to keep that distinction in mind. And also to remember that the notion of home, certainly within sociology of education and in many of the compensatory education programs that have happened all over the world, the notion of home is a very troubled space in education discourse. We have many, many concepts like homeschool discontinuity, cultural discontinuity, cultural disparities between home and school that have framed educational critique for many years. So home is an issue here. I absolutely view this very much in line with what Sinead was just talking about, what Dan talked about at the start. This is an opportunity. I am not hankering after the schools we closed and the system we suspended, not at all. I think we have a system, and many education systems are the same, that are extraordinarily resilient. There's always change, there's always something happening. There are many, many, many inequalities embedded within education, including, like Sinead spoke about, in people with disability. But the reform movement goes on, but the change seems to be quite minimal. And I think this is now an opportunity for us to really tackle that. I think the system, and many of our education systems across the world, has been very good at creating winners and losers, but it has often done that often in the same place, the winners and the losers. I think we paused a system that achieved a lot for most learners, in particular selective and domains. But what we need more than ever is, and in this new rethought education system, is a system that achieves a lot more for all on a much broader range of learning domains. I think so far we have learned that the school is really important. If you look at some of the research that's coming out of the COVID experiences of parents, families, children and young people, both in Ireland and elsewhere, the lack of schooling and the support that schooling provides for children and young people is really, really, really valued and really important. So schools and teachers and their impact and the positions of these has really been affirmed, because we had to do without it. But there are glaring systemic fault lines that this closure of schools clearly pointed to. That for a start, there's a huge variation in the patterns of alignment with the digital world, both in homes, in schools, for parents, for teachers, and for children themselves. One of the problems I think we had with schools is it was a single point of failure, like an engineering term. When the lights went out on schools, people were left fumbling around in the dark. And there is no doubt from the studies that have been done so far that the removal of the schools and the closure of schools compounded existing inequalities and equities in a very stark way. It magnified marginalization for deaf students, for students with additional needs, for lower SES groups. There's a really interesting report done by the ESRI in June that has lots of details in relation to this. So now I think we have become consumed in the school system with 1 meters or 2 meter discussions, which is extraordinary, because that is all about looking inwards. I know there's a practical side to this, but if we keep looking at 1 meter or 2 meter, we just face inside. And I think what we need to do now is we need to look beyond, and we need to look outside of what we had in the past. Many critiques, many critical theorists and critical research in education over many, many decades has talked about disruption, radical reform. If we ever had it, we have a chance now. And I think that is the chance that we really should grasp very, very explicitly. And from that point of view, just in terms of how we go forward, there have always been alternatives in relation to how we could do education and how we could set up an education system. There are decades of perspectives on trying to understand how children and young people learn and develop, and how best we can help them all to do this in the most effective way. There are compelling imperatives to reconsider issues related to justice, diversity, and these perspectives are drawn from a whole range of different discourses and areas of scholarship: equality, equity, social justice, inclusion. All of these different perspectives align together with a real alternative to what our school system could look like. Multiple theorists who have argued for more radical reform of education. We are now at a point where we have to do it because it cannot go back. The new normal will not be the same as the old normal. We are desperately struggling to put back an education system. This is an opportunity to put it back, to reconceptualize it, and to look at some kind of radical reconstruction of it, of the whole system. I'm talking about reconceptualizing learning, which I think we have to do, and reimagining where that learning happens. I think we have to look at extending learning spaces and rethink learning that happens in formal, non-formal and informal contexts. Keeping it all in school is just not going to work anymore. And it arguably wasn't a good system. It wasn't a good system. No argument about it in my view. It wasn't a good system in the past. We need to look at the out of school learning spaces, and we need to critically engage with education in its broadest sense as part of an extended social world. And in terms of, I'm just thinking of a number of different, if we look at education as sense-making, some of the work on Freire around reading the word, to read the world, the environment as a third teacher coming from Reggio Emilia in Italy. There are many, many perspectives that can help us do this. And I'm just going to talk about one very quickly, something we've been working at in NUIG with the School of Education, the Institute of Life Course and Society, and Foroiga, who I'll tell you are doing a lot more than just having youth clubs. We're looking here at the formal spaces that happen within schools and the non-formal learning spaces that happen around schools, and looking at the role technology can play in actually bridging the gap between those in very explicit ways. And I think what we're looking at here is a reconceptualization of where it is learning happens. Many of the youth clubs and youth centres have played a vital role in supporting some of the children from marginalised communities who have really struggled out of school. This is something that's already out there. These are many, many projects that are already out there. So we now have an opportunity to look at some of the different projects that are really working and the outcomes of these projects and start putting it all together. And schools, I think, need to look out in order for that to happen, because they are going to require out of school learning spaces in order to support what's going on in school. And those who are outside need to look in school. So we tie the area, we tie the two spaces together much more explicitly. This is only one idea. There are many, many ideas out there in relation to how we could reform our system, but we need to do it. I think it was quite interesting what Sinead said there. This notion of going back to the core, back to the center, rather than trying to stick something on at the edge. Now we have an opportunity to go back to the core and to re-articulate what it is we want education in its broadest sense to do. And take, as Sinead already pointed out to what she has called an intersectional view of things, a much more intersectional view of education from the center. We have been adding on for too long. It's now an opportunity to rethink from the core out. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much indeed, Gerry. Lots of challenging questions for education and for all of us to consider around education. Lots of food for thought. Can I now bring in our third speaker, Salome? You're very welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be able to talk to you this afternoon, and actually to be part of this very, very important and actually very timely discussions. In the last, I think, 2 months, most of us, or all of us actually, have really witnessed people getting out in the street, young, old, with anger, and really advocating for equal treatment of people living in Ireland and even all over the world. We've seen this. And this actually came as a result of the killing of George Floyd, which has reminded us that we are living in a world where there's still huge, deep inequalities and also unequal power distribution, and the need to challenge this. And this has actually been brought right home here in Ireland, which has actually become a multicultural society with over 200 languages being spoken in the island of Ireland, which is a small island. And actually so many people from all over the world, from different walks of life living here. However, Ireland is still it's still actually a long way to go to ensure that people living in this island of Ireland are very well integrated into the society. And actually my input to you this afternoon, I want to focus on two areas that might help us in a changing Ireland, and actually moving into what the theme of this meeting is all about, rebuilding Ireland, impact of COVID-19, and looking at the whole area of social justice in moving forward. So I'm led actually to believe that, first of all, we have to uphold human rights principles. And the human rights principles, the most important principle in human rights is actually the life itself, the person being alive. And so we really have to respect this life that is actually, that make human human. And also taking it back to the killing of George Floyd, to know that we are all one human race and that we have to uphold the right to life for all of us, regardless of where we are coming from. I also wanted to address the whole area of the right to live with the dignity. Like Sinead have said and Gerry have said, most people are denied their right and they are treated differently because of the way they look. People with a disability, even actually during our work and through our work in Irish human rights, we deal with cases and issues we hear every time about the way people with disability are treated very poorly. Whether it's physical disability, mental disability, the disabilities are of different types and people are different, are treated very differently. And so it's very important that we embrace the diversity of the people that we have in our country. And this is actually Ireland, whether it's with the people with the disability, whether it's people coming from different countries where we don't even understand their language, or the way they behave or the way they are getting on with their life. And that we treat them with respect and dignity regardless of where they are coming from. Many times, such people are actually denied services. And I work with women, migrant women, who even when they go looking for services and support, they are treated with suspicions, they are disbelieved, or they are not even welcomed in the first place. And so we have to learn as a small island of Ireland to treat people with respect and dignity as our starting point to be able to embrace the diversity we are talking about. Many people are also still denied access to basic needs. These basic needs, whether it's basic needs, the right to education. For example, we've seen people who have come here seeking international protection who will not actually be able to attend that level, mainly because they cannot be able to pay for this third level. And this right to education is a right that everybody should be equipped. They should actually have this right. Even with the issues of lack of housing and the challenges that we face with the housing, we are still faced with many people not being able to access housing, even when there are available houses there. We've worked with many women, for example, from my own organizations, who are not able to access housing because they look different and they have to be accompanied by Irish people to be able to get this housing. So access to basic needs such as housing are denied some of the time because of the way the people look, or because they are seen as they don't belong, or they're not coming from the usual. We also have to improve the living standard of the very vulnerable, in particular those who are living in poor conditions, those who are sleeping in the street, those who do not have anywhere to go in their emergency accommodations, and also elderly people who are sometimes abused, and we forget about them. That it's very important that as a society that we uphold to the human rights of even the elderly and the people that are in our society that are not able to get out there or to fight for themselves. In addition to basic rights, we also talk about decent work, and that most people still are not able to get the work that matches their qualifications, for example, from a migrant background. And this has been very horrifying based on the fact that it's actually very well documented in researches that has been carried out by Economic Social Research Ireland and other organizations, including Irish Human Rights, that sometimes people do not actually get the jobs that matches their qualifications, even though we have the Equal Status Act and also Employment Act of 2014. And so even with these laws and policies, we still find it very difficult to be able to give people their rights and allow them to have this right. Moving into my second point of addressing structural and social injustice or inequality, this is an area that Ireland really needs to look seriously into. We've seen it actually during the time of COVID-19, of that, in our work with migrant women, for example, have been providing care, and their jobs and roles has been found to be essential. Yet before, people look at care work as dirty work and work that is not even suitable for many people. But this is essential work that actually is supporting so many people who need it, and during emergencies like this time of COVID-19. These kind of jobs need to be respected. People need to be paid for the work that they have done and actually the contribution that they have made at the same time. Power structures have also been challenging for our society that we need to look into. And I spoke about the distribution of power at the beginning. It's the way the decisions are made, but also who is involved in making these decisions, whether it's in terms of education. Do we include men and women in making decisions when we are talking about education and how our children are educated? Are we inviting people from the migrant background who have now become part of our society to be part of this decision making? Quite often, they are not included. Moving forward and going beyond COVID-19, we will need to look in who is left behind and actually bring them to the table if they are needed. And for the fact still they will be needed. We also need to look into the marginalized groups and those who are living at the edge of the society. People with mental health issues, the youth, those who are recovering from drugs, and all people that need to be supported to come forward to live dignified lives. That we really need to look into the gaps that we have within our society based on the status of people that we are living around or with. But this distribution of resources and power have to be shared equally. We also have to be able to support women and girls who have been going through abuse. We all know during this time of COVID-19 that sexual abuse and harassment has been huge. In our work, we have many cases that has been reported to us of women and girls having to suffer sexual abuse and attack during this time of COVID-19. Sometimes they have language barriers, they have fear, they're intimidated, and they're not even able to speak out. That we must look into ways of how these people can be supported and brought forward to be listened and to be supported. We must therefore address these deep inequalities in terms of accessibility, whether it's access to health for those who may have even the medical card, but still they are not able to access, for example, counseling or other needs that they may want to access. Access to work is a huge problem, in particular among migrant community. And again, based on the research that I mentioned earlier, it was found by that research that the employers are having what we call ethnic barrier, that they choose whom they want. So if you sound different, you come from different background, you are actually not anywhere near to get a job. And so many people continue to struggle with poor standard of living because they are not able to get jobs or to access jobs that can help them to improve their living standard. And in 21st century, we really need to think this clearly and open our door to the diversity that we have and also understand that diversity is a good thing. Tackling disadvantage is not a one-day thing or a month or a year. We first of all have to learn on how to include people in our work and in says in school for not to have migrant children in our education or in our schools. So there's no need of putting a equality statement or even educating ourselves on equality. But you do not have to have these students or people from migrant background to enlighten yourself on issues of equality and justice, and also how you can include them or understand. So we are reminded that we really need to learn ourselves on how we can embrace people and include them. And by including them is actually bringing them into our work in terms of what we put into our policies, into our papers, into those organizations, making sure that also we have staff from different backgrounds who are part of our team, so that if we are providing services, members of their community can identify with the staff. This is including in the education system, it's including in health and in all areas, that we have to be inclusive and look at the diversity as a good thing. We must also keep to the promise and uphold the promise of leaving no one behind. This is actually according to the 2030 agenda that Ireland is so much keen talking about. And we have so many groups and organizations that are working on the 2030 agenda, on the sustainable development goals. But most of the time, you're looking at these issues as they are issues which are very far away from us, that they are issues of the developing world. I'm from Kenya, and maybe some people might think these development goals and sustainable development goals are for the developing countries. But really, they are for us here. They talk about poverty, where we have poverty here. They talk about issues of women and gender inequality. They talk about how we should not leave anyone behind. And so the importance of understanding and really affirming and having that stamp that Ireland is not going behind, that we have become a multicultural country or society, and that we really need to be inclusive and not to leave anybody behind. George Floyd killing is calling us to be able to look into this and we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salome. I think that's an excellent note to pause on. And thank you for raising these questions of inclusion and the inequalities that are deeply embedded in our society as we become more and more multicultural. Can we move now to our final speaker? Our final panelist is Colette Bennett. Colette, over to you.
Thank you so much to Yvonne and to all at the Royal Irish Academy for inviting me to speak. It's quite intimidating given how prestigious your other speakers are, but I will do my best. So as you said, you know, I am a research and policy analyst with Social Justice Ireland, and what we look at is really how to address the causes of inequality. So how to look at these structural systemic causes that lead us in the position where we really need to actually rebuild Ireland, to reimagine Ireland before we can start rebuilding it. So Sinead mentioned in her piece, you know, that idea that COVID-19 was an equivalization, that it had been talked about as the great leveler, when in reality, it was the effects of it were felt very differently depending on your socioeconomic background, depending on your circumstances. The fact that we had over 14,500 households who couldn't self-isolate, who couldn't socially distance with any great effectiveness because they didn't have adequate facilities, they lived in overcrowded accommodation, they lived in communal establishments. That, you know, it's just a small snapshot of, you know, where a great disadvantage was felt during this pandemic. Gerry spoke in relation to education during this time and this notion of homeschooling, when really it's just a mad scramble for people to look after their children while trying to work, while trying to take on other caring duties and look after themselves in the wake of a global pandemic. And we know, for example, that there are a great number of students experiencing educational disadvantage who that gap will be widened for, because the fact that they can't access internet or they can't access the digital infrastructure that they need, and that their parents can't support them, you know, to the extent that they need, because of the fact that they're also working. And many of low-income workers are actually these frontline essential service providers that are absolutely critical now. You know, so the whole idea of work has been absolutely turned on its head by this pandemic. So in looking at this and in looking at the theme of rebuilding Ireland and reimagining what Ireland should really look like, you know, we would put forward this idea of a new social contract. So looking at our relationship to state operators and how the state should really underpin and support the people living in Ireland to actually have a decent standard of living. So, you know, one of the key issues for me would be removing the amount of privatisation of public services. It costs a huge amount of money and it's not particularly effective. But if we look at how a new social contract might actually be put together, we would base it on 5 main pillars. So those 5 pillars would be a vibrant economy. We need to have an economy. It cannot be the be all and end all as it was after the 2008 crash, but it does need to be decent. We need to provide decent jobs. We need to reimagine this concept of work, that it isn't synonymous with having a job, that caring in the home is really important. And we've seen how important it is in the current climate. We need to deal with the deficit. We're going to have a pretty large deficit at the end of this year, probably into next year as well, if the estimates are anything to go by. So that needs to be ring fenced. We need to look at that over the next 3 years, and we need to borrow for that. We can borrow at quite low rates at the market at the moment. So we need to look at how we best use that ability to borrow in order to address the difficulties that COVID have brought, and to actually move forward into this new social contract. We need to look at adjusting the EU fiscal rules to cope with a post-COVID reality. You know, it's no longer acceptable to have an austerity measure or an austerity program in place for the next 10 years. And we've seen the damage that has done. We're still living, there are still households living with that damage. So we need to rethink what an economy might look like. We need to ensure that there is financial stability within the economy, and to integrate the Sustainable Development Framework into economic policy. So again, we're not just looking at growth and constant productivity, that we're actually looking at what the sustainable development needs from an economic standpoint, and underpin that. We need to boost public investment, and I'll talk about, you know, decent services and infrastructure in the second pillar, but we need to look at what investment we need in terms of our infrastructure, what our important infrastructures actually are, and how we can best support that with investment and public investment, that it's not just privatization as a rote, because that just gives you a very, very short-term win without any long-term gain at all. We need, as I say, to look at decent jobs, to look at the whole area of low pay, to look at job precariousness, and to really look at, well, how we can upskill all of our workers, particularly those in more precarious employments, to have more sustainable jobs into the long term. And we need to reduce inequality. We have a persistent and pervasive poverty problem in this country. For the last over 10 years, we have straddled somewhere along the 700,000 mark of people living below the poverty line. The most recent poverty rate as of the 2018 data is 14%. That's 680,000 people living at risk of poverty. 200,000 of those are children. And even within that, there are obviously going to be discrepancies in terms of different communities experience higher rates of poverty. Older people experience poverty differently. People with disabilities experience higher rates of poverty. People in different communities, new communities and traveller communities experience higher rates of poverty. And we need to look at how we can overall address that. Then we need to look, as the second pillar of the social contract, at decent services and infrastructure. So, as I said, we need to really increase our investment and address these systemic issues. So we need to look at housing, for example. We need to have decent social housing, not social housing solutions that are basically private rental sector, but actual local authority built, approved housing body built, social housing on state lands. We need to look at addressing and preventing homelessness. We need to look at bridging the gap in terms of our educational divide, particularly in relation to our lifelong learning programs. And again, that goes back to upskilling and reskilling some of our manual workers. We also need to look at our younger population in terms of those who are not in education, employment or training. We need to desperately need to look at our healthcare system. You know, we have relied on acute services, hospital services for so long, to the extent that we have one of the highest capacity of any of the countries. So we have a 95% capacity rate. That means that 95% of our hospital beds are occupied. We need to start looking at moving from an acute-centric service to a more community-based primary healthcare service. So, you know, increased healthcare in the communities, increased GP teams, increased public health nurses, and all that entails. We need to properly resource our mental health services. We need to invest in our community services and remove barriers to employment. So there is a very harmful narrative when we talk about social housing, for example, and we talk about people in poverty, and this notion that, that there's a whole level of social difficulties that come with them. That is not the product of housing or those communities or those people. That is the product of a lack of community services, a lack of supports, a lack of social supports, a lack of community Gardaí, a lack of education, an educational disadvantage that is not being met through the DESH programme, albeit, the DESH is certainly helping where it is in place. We need to look at a greater recognition of the role of carers and working in the home. And Salome addressed that in her piece as well. And we need to provide for a minimum social floor. So the introduction of a floor of basic income and basic services. What can people who live in Ireland today expect as a bare minimum? Where is that standard of care? We need to index our social welfare payments to the minimum essential budget standard. And that work has been done by the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice. They recently published their 2020 report. And again, the gap between social welfare payments and the minimum essential standard of living is still there. We need to introduce a cost of disability payment and recognise the fact that persons living with disabilities have increased costs because of that. And we need to introduce a state-led childcare system so that we can activate people who want to work outside of the home to actually be able to do that without being presented with this barrier that disproportionately affects women and disproportionately affects single parent households from entering into the workforce. All of those services.
Sorry, Colette, just to say to you that I think that there's a huge amount of information that you have laid out. Many of the challenges that you present are clearly part of a major rethinking of the social contract. And I'm just wondering if we might just be able to leave it there and allow some of the questions that are just lighting up our chat at the moment could come
to say one thing, Yvonne. I'm so sorry.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Because if I don't finish our 5 pillars, I'll be murdered. But the other 3 would be a just taxation, because those services and infrastructure need to be paid for, and that needs to be just, it needs to be fair and equitable. So higher earners and corporates need to pay their fair share. We also need good governance. We need a social dialogue. We need real participation and deliberative democracy so that people, citizens affected by all of these policies can actually have their say. And finally, we need sustainability. We need climate justice. We need to protect the environment. We need to have sustainability in terms of jobs and rural and regional development, and also in terms of a real sustainable progress index to measure our policies against the Sustainable Development Goals and against our own progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colette. I'm sorry that I had to encourage you to wrap up there, but our time is short and we want to try and get some of the responses from our attendees in to the conversation as a whole. We have had lots of different queries and questions. I will take a selection of them as we go forward. So can I perhaps first come to Gerry and ask Gerry, there was a question around practical reforms, and what practical reforms do you suggest to education to reduce inequality? In it, other than youth clubs, are there informal learning spaces that could be used? For example, would more home learning, supported home learning help? What are your ideas in relation to
Yvonne.
that.
I answered actually some of that in the chat. I saw that in the chat. I think it's a question of rethinking where learning happens more in a much more broad way than we do up until now. I think if we look to the wider community, there are a lot of learning spaces out there, libraries, youth centres, community-based groups where learning can be supported. I do, but not just supported. I'm talking about where learning should be happening and where it can be enriched. And where all students' learning can be enriched. I suppose I'm thinking of a range of different ways of thinking about where people learn, and it's practical in one way because it's already out there. This is not something that isn't there already. The youth clubs, Voroya, for instance, have a wide range of different projects that they engage youth in, and many marginalized youth are engaged in these projects, and they're really they enrich their lives and they enrich education in its broadest sense. The libraries have really interesting projects going on, but it's more to go back into the core of it again and actually to recognize that all of these different broader spaces have a role to play in the broad education of everybody. And so schools have to look at what they do differently. We have to look at how schools buildings are used more broadly. And when they're not used for school purposes, can they be used to enhance student learning? Yes, home learning is part of that. But I would love to see a situation where when home learning is not possible, and I think we had from Colette there, we had a very clear sense of where things fall apart for certain social groups, that there are very explicit and very clear places where home can go as well as school can go to enhance learning. And I think the pieces are out there, and if you want to talk practically, they're out there practically. It's just a question of reimagining what we do and bringing all those pieces back into the conversation.
Great, thank you very much, Gerry. And I'd like to turn to Sinead now, because there's an interesting question here around COVID-19 has placed the needs of the economy against the interests of health, picking up from one of the points that you made. And the question is, can we develop a different model here? So any thoughts, any reflections on that, Sinead?
I think it's interesting when we talk about capitalism or equality and if the two can exist together. And some theorists would say absolutely no, that in terms of true equality and for intersectionality and inclusion to exist, capitalism is not the framework by which it's required. But I think when we talk about the economy and we talk about it something that is other, particularly to minority or to marginalized groups, what we are not taking an insight into is the fact that these communities are consumers, creators, employees, and colleagues too. So just to give you a sense from the disability community perspective, that the annual salary, kind of the annual spending power of the disability community globally is about 1.3 trillion US dollars. And whilst that's globally and, is kind of in terms of a population the size of China, I think by not including disabled people, going back to the earlier points that so many people have made, by not including the lived experience of those who are on the edges of society from the very beginning of how we design systems or how we design a new social contract, as Colette said, that we are actually not going to be able to include those people and include their experiences, but also include their spending power. I think it needs to be more universally considered in terms of justice and equity. And I think we need to make sure that the lived experience of those individuals is from the very beginning. Do I think capitalism is the ideal solution to bring in equity? No, but it's the system that we have currently. And for me, my frustration when we talk about the journey to inclusion is that I would like it to happen within my lifetime. And if we are going to wait until we build a whole new system in order for people to be able to participate, that is just too long. So what can we do to tilt the lens on the system that currently exists in order to include the most amount of people in an authentic and meaningful way?
Great, thank you very much, Sinead. I think lots of things that we can take out of that. Salome, I would like to come to you now. And there are a number of different questions around direct provision. And I guess the point is that quite recently, the Irish government said that they were going to reform this the issue of direct provision. In your view, what would be a good alternative? What would be an alternative that would actually be workable and that could replace the direct provision system that we have at the moment?
Yeah, I think so many people have asked these questions, and I know also the government have been consulting with the different groups and people to ask them what would be the very suitable way of accommodating asylum seekers or people who are seeking international protection, because that's what they are. And I think actually the most important one that could fit with the human rights, when we talk about the human right thing, to know the way people are living in their own houses and actually having them have the freedom to cook what they want, to live, with the dignity and with respect with their children, rather than being confined into small rooms of what is happening now. So for me, I would actually advocate for a way that they can be housed with the rest of the community and the rest of the society, just how people people are actually put into housing, that could work better and even much more cheaper than maybe perhaps the way the direct provision is running as for now. So the housing model, just like any other person, would be the very best one if it's at all possible.
Okay, thank you very much, Salome. That's very helpful to have. A number of different attendees have been raising the question in one shape or form around universal basic income. So turning to Colette now, what do you think is the prospects for the introduction of a universal basic income in Ireland in order to address poverty and to empower people to take control over their own lives? Would you and Social Justice Ireland have a view on this?
We have lots of views on a universal basic income. In terms of the prospects of it, I remain a hopeless optimist. We saw in the manifestos of the various political parties, I think the Greens and Fianna Fáil had some discussion around the introduction of a basic income, and Fianna Fáil had gone one step further in that it was intended to establish a commission. Now, how that translated into the actual programme for government has been that will be looked at by the Low Pay Commission. So, it really will depend on the political will in terms of whether or not a basic income will be introduced within the lifetime of this government. And in terms of, its capacity to support people in caring work or to support, to provide that minimum floor, very much so we would advocate in favour of a universal basic income, to do just that, to provide that safety net so that people can undertake meaningful work, be that caring work, be that work in the community, and have that security that they will still be able to have some standard of living.
Great. Thank you very much, Colette. That's really helpful and interesting. So obviously there are lots and lots of challenges that all our speakers have put forward today. I'm going to turn to each of you now, and I'm going to ask you to be as, if you like, pithy as you can be. So I'm going to ask you what is the one thing you would like to see happen? Just one thing that would remake Irish society to be stronger and better after COVID-19. And so I will go to you in turn, and I will start with you, Colette. So
Thank you.
What's your one wish to have happen?
Investment, absolutely. If we invest in addressing the systemic issues around inequalities and poverty, so we would invest in better quality, lower cost housing, whether that's affordable housing or social housing. We would invest in healthcare, we would invest in education, and this is the opportunity to do it. COVID-19 has exposed everything that people like my organisation and others have been talking about for years. So to really get into that, there was an excellent report by the St. Vincent de Paul published a couple of weeks ago, and they estimate, at a moderate estimate, that we're spending €4.5 billion on the cost of poverty, on just addressing poverty. Whereas if we invested that, if we actually took that and looked at how we might spend that money to address the causes rather than the consequences of poverty, we'd be in a much better position.
Great, thank you, Colette. Salome, in your view, your one wish for this? Sorry, Salome, you're muted. Can you take yourself off mute, please?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. If we are going to be an integrated society of where everybody is treated with respect and dignity moving forward, and if we are going to avoid this inequality and injustice that has been happening even before COVID-19, I think it will be very important and variable for all of us to work in partnership and in solidarity. And by this, I mean, most people do ask, how do we get migrants to participate into our activities or into our work? I'm actually giving them the opportunity to be able to engage with the organization Akidwa, the Migrant Women's Network in Ireland, to be able to engage migrants, because we are very much willing, and we have many women and men in this country from the migrant background who are willing to be part and parcel of what is happening at every level of the society. So for me, partnership and working in solidarity with everybody and with others is the way to go or to move forward.
Great, thank you, Salome. Turning to you, Gerry, your one wish, if you had this magic wand and could bring it about.
Okay. I think that at the center of any strong society is a strong education system. I think we know that for many, many reasons. I suppose we need to realize that education came from an idea that was the privilege of the few, and it was the privilege of the few for a long, long time. It has been tweaked over the years, undoubtedly, but I think it now needs more than tweaking and adding on. I really am struck by the need to re-articulate a vision and actions around that vision about an education system that's for all, based on principles of inclusion, of principles of equity, principles of social justice, and from there, at its core, move forward. It's a realignment. It's just a rejigging of where we're at. It just needs that, and this is the time.
Great, Gerry. Thank you very much. Sinead, turning to you. Your wish for remaking Irish society stronger and better.
I think so much of the discussion today has been important about looking at what a new Ireland could look like, rebuilding, starting from the very beginning. And whilst that's essential for me, one of the changes that I would really love to see happen in Ireland is changes in policies that have already been drafted and amendments need to be made. So specifically what I would like to see is the optional protocol for the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities to be permitted and to be allowed and to be drafted to ensure that disabled people can protest when their rights are not upheld, to ensure that the legislation surrounding historic and protected buildings do not present architecture before people, that accessibility is not something that is compromised due to the aesthetic regard for architecture, but that disabled people are included in cultural spaces and not just in spaces like housing and education that is deemed more important. And I think whilst now we have this opportunity where government is beginning to understand what its cabinet and what its portfolios may be, it's an opportunity to make the Dáil and the Seanad accessible so that disabled people, particularly physically and visibly disabled people, can be our public representatives. But also, if we do have budget and resources, to ensure that we have special advisors to our most senior members of government, asking about the diversity and the intersectionality of those advisors has never been more important.
Thank you, Sinead. The four of you leave us with many, many ideas from your inspiring presentations and conversations with us today. So thank you sincerely, Sinead, Gerry, Salome, and Colette, for your time and for being panelists in this conversation. I would like to now close by thanking all our attendees for also being part of this conversation. I can see that the chat has been very, very active and lively. We hope you enjoyed this as much as we did. And I want to thank on your behalf the members and the staff of the Royal Irish Academy for enabling this conversation to happen. In particular, I want to thank Professor Daniel Gray, Jennifer Keneally, Jennifer Riley, and my own team in TU Dublin, especially Irene Gallagher and Caoimhe Kiernan, who worked behind the scenes with me to enable this happen. So until we meet again, stay safe, stay well, and goodbye.